the Chuck Taylor All-Star is the worst lifting shoe in existence. That is a lie. The Chuck Taylor is actually not a lifting shoe. And now if it were a lifting shoe, it would be the worst in existence. However, it is not a lifting shoe. This is a lifting shoe. And a lifting shoe has three components that make it a lifting shoe that are very important. We're going to start with the first and most important component. It ain't the heel. The first and most important component is the non-deformable rigid sole, so that you have efficient force transfer between you and the floor. If you've ever lifted in lifting shoes, you've squatted, deadlifted, snatched, cleaned, pressed, whatever, and you've accidentally started to maybe warm up in your regular shoes, like a Chuck, for instance. This will sometimes happen to some of our newer members. They might accidentally forget to put on their lifting shoes before they start lifting. It will feel like you're lifting on a pillow by comparison. It's much more squishy, it's much more unstable compared to the very good stability you get from this non-deformable rigid sole right here. And when the weight gets challenging, when it gets heavy, and it's going to happen, it's going to get challenging, it's going to get heavy, a rigid sole is an important thing to have. So that's actually the most important feature. The second feature is are these metatarsal straps, or these Velcro straps right here. A lifting shoe will have one or two of them. They gather the foot together. They provide lateral support. They provide arch support. Specifically, it's going to act like a belt for your foot. So that's a very nice thing to have. Again, it's all about providing stability. The third feature, not the most important feature, is the elevated heel. It's a slightly elevated heel. Most lifting shoes will be somewhere between 1/2 inch and 3/4 of an inch. And it's going to provide a little bit more quad involvement for the lift. On the squat, for most people, it'll make depth a little bit easier to achieve. But again, the most important feature is really the non-deformable rigid sole. Now, why is a Chuck Taylor a terrible lifting shoe if it actually was a lifting shoe? The Chuck Taylor is the lifting shoe for people who started to think about lifting shoes but never completed the thought, okay? It fails all the criteria. It doesn't have a rigid sole. A Chuck Taylor is squishy just like any other shoe. In fact, there are plenty of other regular shoes out there that would make a better lifting shoe, a better shoe for lifting than a Chuck Taylor. Work boots, men's dress shoes would work fine. There's even some really flat, almost barefoot running shoes that would have a more rigid sole than a Chuck Taylor, simply because they basically don't even have a sole. You're basically standing on the floor, which is about as rigid as it can get. A Chuck Taylor certainly doesn't provide any type of arch support, and the heel is non-existent. Now, some people may want to use a Chuck Taylor for a deadlift, all right? It's still the worst shoe possible, because if you're using a Chuck Taylor for a deadlift, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to reduce, in other words, if you're trying to avoid the heel, you're trying to reduce the distance that you have to pull. But this is, again, where the Chuck Taylor is the worst of both worlds. It's not a flat, it's not a real low profile, get you close to the floor type of shoe. Yes, it might get you a little bit closer than this, but there's a whole lot of shoes out there that will get you closer to the floor than a Chuck Taylor. So it doesn't have the rigidity that a lifting shoe does, and it doesn't get you close to the floor like a true flat does. And by the way, they make deadlift shoes, so if you want to get close to the floor, you can get a deadlift shoe that has a pretty rigid sole and is very, very close to the floor, very thin sole, and actually has a Velcro strap, actually has a metatarsal strap as well. So the Chuck Taylor is the worst of both worlds. It's not rigid, it's not deformable, it does squish, and it's not very low profile. It doesn't get you close to the floor. So if you're gonna get some lifting shoes, treat it seriously, go out and actually get yourself some lifting shoes. Now, if Chuck Taylors are the only pair of shoes that you have and you can't afford to buy anymore, by all means, lift in Chuck Taylors. People have lifted huge weights in Chuck Taylors. They've lifted huge weights in a whole bunch of shoes. Likewise, LeBron James will kick my butt in basketball any day of the week, even when he's sick. That being said, no matter what shoes he's wearing, that being said, he's going to choose to wear basketball shoes whenever he can. Likewise, I would encourage you to wear lifting shoes whenever you can. If you don't, we can still be friends. We're just going to disagree. Hope this helps you get stronger and live better.